I have not spoken her name in 40 years. It feels strange now, like lifting the lid from an old jar and finding the air inside still foul with memory. Charleston has changed since those days. The river is quieter, the houses wear their moss-like age spots on the skin, and the bells of St. Philip's ring for no one I remember. Yet whenever they toll, I still taste the faint bitterness of tea on my tongue. I was her only child. My mother, Eugenia Loudon, was a woman of astonishing poise and cruelty in equal measure. Her voice carried through the house like the striking of porcelain, delicate, perfect, and cold. Father had died during one of those endless summers when the air itself felt drunk with fever. His portrait, hung above the parlor fireplace, seemed to watch us as the years rolled in like storms. She would polish the glass every Sunday, though she never wept. I think she preferred the dead that way, still obedient, incapable of disappointing her. Our home stood near the harbor, where the salt wind always smelled faintly of decay. I used to help her in the kitchen, though she said a lady's hands should never smell of iron or soap. She would prepare the tea precisely the same way each morning, boiling water measured by habit, the tin spoon tapping twice against the porcelain cup. I remember her watching the surface of that tea, as though waiting for something to rise from it. After Father's death, the servants left one by one. Mother said it was because the Loudon house had lost its civility. I suspect it was because the house had begun to rot from within. There were small things at first, milk spoiling faster than it should, rats appearing where there were no crumbs, the endless smell of damp even in the driest months. She said it was Charleston's weather. I thought even then that it was punishment. When I was 17, I began to notice the tremor in her hand. It would seize her wrist mid-pour so that tea spilled down the rim of her cup. She would glare at the puddle as if it had offended God himself. A woman's steadiness, she once said, is all that keeps her from ruin. Those words sank deep into me, as did everything she said. It was around this time that the letters began to arrive. They were sealed in black wax, though never addressed to me. She kept them hidden in the drawer of her writing desk, but sometimes when she left the room, I would glimpse a name written in a man's hand, Mr. F.A. Rowan. I did not know him then, but his presence, even in ink, made her face change. Her lips softened, her eyes almost human for a moment, then hardened again as if she had remembered herself too late. I recall the first Sunday she failed to rise for church. The kettle had been left unwashed, the tea leaves still damp from the day before. I heard her cough echo through the hall, a long hollow sound that rattled the silence like bones in a drawer. When I brought her tray, she looked smaller somehow, as though the bed itself had begun to consume her. "Too sweet," she whispered after sipping. "You never could measure properly." Her words carried no affection, yet something in her tone made me stay longer by her side. That night, I could not sleep. The rain had begun again, drumming against the shutters like a question that would not end. I thought of how frail her hand had looked on the porcelain cup, how thin her voice had become. I told myself I pitied her, that I wished her peace. But even then, beneath the pity, something darker had begun to stir. There is a kind of love that curdles when left too long in silence. It thickens, hardens, and begins to resemble hate. I would not name it then, but I felt it growing in me like a second heart, one that beat for her and against her all at once. I suppose that was the beginning. The first time I looked at my mother and wondered what her tea might taste like if I were the one to prepare it. In the weeks that followed, I began to take charge of the household, not by command but by quiet necessity. Mother's illness deepened, and with it came a strange stillness that settled over the rooms like dusk. The doctors said it was a fever of the lungs, though I never saw her flush or sweat. Her skin remained pale as china, her breath shallow and deliberate, as if each inhalation required permission. She refused to leave her bed, and so the rhythm of the house bent itself around her, tea at dawn, broth by noon, and silence at night. I learned to prepare her tea exactly as she did. I measured the leaves, timed the boil, and poured with the same care she had taught me as a child. Yet she would taste it and frown, saying it lacked warmth or sweetness or memory. "You must love what you serve," she told me once. "Even bitterness can be pleasant when offered with affection." Her words lingered long after the tray was empty. I thought of how often she had fed others the same. Her voice smooth and loving even when her eyes were cold. The first time I tasted the tea myself, I felt nothing but a faint metallic note, like a coin pressed to the tongue. I remember thinking it tasted of her, poised, distant, unforgiving. I began to imagine that each cup carried a fragment of her spirit, steeped and dissolved, until I could no longer tell where she ended, and I began. Perhaps that was her wish all along, to live through me in small invisible doses. Outside, the Loudon garden had fallen into ruin. The once white lilies were bruised with mildew, the stone path swallowed by moss. When I tended them, neighbors would pass and nod politely, never asking about my mother, though I saw curiosity flicker behind their eyes. They knew, of course. They always knew. Rumor traveled through Charleston faster than weather. A widow fading in her parlor, a daughter too quiet for her age. One afternoon, while dusting the parlor shelves, I found a small vial tucked behind the silverware box. Its contents were pale and granular, like sugar left too long in the damp. The label had faded, but one word remained visible: arsenate. My fingers trembled as I turned it over. It was not mine, nor, I realized with a hollow certainty, was it Father's. I remembered the letters in her drawer, the way her hands had shaken after reading them. I wondered if this powder had been part of that correspondence, a gift, perhaps from Mr. Rowan, a cure or something else entirely. That night, I confronted her gently, almost childishly, asking what the vial contained. She laughed, not cruelly but softly, as one might laugh at a naive question. "Medicine," she said, "for roses and men alike." She would not explain further, though her gaze lingered on me with curious weight, as if measuring how much I understood. From that moment, I began to watch her differently. Every sip she took became a study. The movement of her lips, the faint tremor in her fingers, the pause between swallow and breath. Sometimes I thought I saw relief in her eyes, as though each cup carried her closer to peace. Other times she seemed to resist it, her expression tightening with some inner struggle I could not name. I kept the vial hidden after that. Not to protect her, but to understand her. I would hold it to the light at night, watching the powder catch the moon's glow like dust on a coffin lid. I told myself it was curiosity, the natural desire of a daughter trying to preserve what little remained of her mother's mystery. But I knew better. I was beginning to crave the same control she once held over me, the quiet power of being the one who serves. By the time her birthday came, she was too weak to rise. I prepared her tea as always, though I added something new. A single pinch of the powder, no more than a breath. My hand did not shake. She drank it without question, her eyes closing in what looked like serenity. "That," she whispered, "tastes just right." It was the first compliment she had given me in years, and in that moment, standing by her bedside, I felt something close to love again, a terrible, trembling love that had forgotten how to be kind. After that day, her decline seemed merciful, gradual, quiet, almost gentle. She no longer spoke in full sentences, only fragments that drifted like prayers half remembered. I would sit beside her and listen as she murmured names I did not know, places she had never taken me. Sometimes she called for Father, though I could not tell whether she meant my father or hers. The distinction blurred, as though her memories had folded into one long, unending grief. The tea tray remained between us each morning, though I noticed she no longer drank as eagerly. It was as if she sensed what I had done, or perhaps had been waiting for me to do it all along. The air in the house thickened, not from sickness, but from the slow gathering of silence. Even the servants seemed to move more quietly, their footsteps dulled by the weight of something unspoken. I began to keep the curtains drawn through the day. unwilling to let the neighbors' eyes peer into our dim world. They still came by with condolences, baskets of fruit and perfumed letters. I thanked them politely, never inviting them in. Grief was a private inheritance in our family, passed down, not shared. At night I sat by her bedside and watched the candlelight tremble across her face. The lines around her mouth had softened, as though death was smoothing away the parts of her that once resisted tenderness. She would open her eyes sometimes and look at me with an expression I couldn't name. Not love nor forgiveness, but recognition. It was as though she saw herself in me, and perhaps she did. There were moments when I thought she wanted to speak, to release some final truth from her lips, but each time the effort faded into a sigh. I told myself she was comfortable, that what I had done was a mercy. I repeated it until it sounded like scripture, but the mind is cruel in the quiet hours. It gnaws at the soft edges of conviction. One evening, as I poured the tea, I caught my reflection in the silver of the kettle, my face pale, eyes hollowed from sleeplessness. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw her expression looking back, faint and sorrowful. The steam blurred us together until I could not tell who was who. When she finally passed, it was not in the way I imagined. There was no struggle, no gasp, only the faintest exhalation, like a candle surrendering its last flame. Her hand rested against the blanket, light as paper. I did not cry. I only sat beside her, the room still except for the faint ticking of the clock, which suddenly felt unbearably loud. I waited for something, a feeling, a sign, a voice, but none came. The silence afterward was too clean, too complete. It frightened me more than her death. The funeral was modest. I arranged it myself, choosing white lilies for her casket, though she had always preferred violets. People came and whispered kindly of her virtues, her piety, her grace, her steadfastness. I smiled and said nothing. Their words drifted through me like smoke, carrying neither comfort nor anger. In their eyes, she was a woman who suffered nobly. None of them saw the other woman, the one who smiled while she controlled every breath I took, who made me believe obedience was devotion. That night, after they laid her in the earth, I returned home alone. The air smelled faintly of rain and turned soil. Her teacup still rested on the tray by her bed. I lifted it, turning it in my hands, tracing the faint crack along its rim. I thought of throwing it away, of purging the house of her presence, but I couldn't. I washed it instead, gently, as if it was still hers. For weeks after, I caught myself preparing 2 cups instead of 1. Habit, I told myself. But each time I lifted the kettle, a strange warmth came over me, a steadiness I had never felt before. I began to sleep in her room, surrounded by her scent, her things, her silence. I told myself it was loneliness, but I knew better. The longer she was gone, the more I became her. The first time I realized this, I was sitting before her mirror. My hair was pinned in the same manner she wore it, my blouse buttoned to the throat. I stared at my reflection until the candle burned low. The line between remembrance and resurrection had blurred entirely. When I finally stood, I whispered aloud, not to her but as her. It tastes just right. The house changed after her burial, though not in ways one might expect. It did not feel emptier. If anything, it felt more awake, as though her absence had unlatched something that had long been waiting in silence. The floors creaked differently beneath my feet. The walls seemed to breathe when the night air settled in. I found myself listening for her footsteps without realizing it, half expecting the faint rustle of her skirts moving through the hall. The rational part of me knew she was gone, the body cold, the earth sealed. But reason has little power in a home built on repetition and ritual. Each morning I continued to make the tea. I told myself it was for remembrance, a simple act to honor her. Yet I could not ignore how naturally my hands moved, measuring, steeping, pouring, the way she once had. The scent filled the kitchen, as it always did, soft and bitter, and I would carry the cup to the dining room, placing it at the head of the table. There, in the sunlight that crept through the shutters, it would cool untouched. I never drank it, not then. I only sat and watched the steam rise and fade, as if waiting for her to return and lift it to her lips. Neighbors came less often. Their condolences had exhausted themselves, and their curiosity had turned to gossip. They whispered about my solitude, about how I kept the house as though she still lived here. I heard fragments of it when I passed through town, their pity disguised as concern. "She's not well," one woman said once, her voice barely above a whisper. "The poor thing's still keeping her mother's habits." I smiled when I heard it, not in defense, but in a strange, hollow amusement. They did not understand that the habits were all that kept me whole. Some nights I would light the lamp in her bedroom and sit beside her empty bed. The sheets were pressed, the pillows fluffed, the Bible left open on the same verse she had been reading the week before she died. The room smelled faintly of lavender oil and dust. I would sit there for hours, my hands folded in my lap, speaking softly, not to her but to the idea of her. I told her about the neighbors, about the weather, about the quiet ache that had settled in my chest. Sometimes I swore I heard the faintest sigh in reply, a settling of fabric or breath drawn through unseen lips. The first true unease came when I began finding small things misplaced, a hairpin on the dresser, though I had not used one in days, a handkerchief folded differently than I remembered, the faint imprint of a teacup ring on her old writing desk. I blamed my own forgetfulness at first. Grief can make one careless, I told myself, but as the days passed, the pattern grew. Every time I cleaned, something new would shift, never large, never obvious, just enough to make me question the edges of my memory. One evening I returned from town to find the parlor door open. I had locked it that morning. Inside, the air was heavy, unmoving, as though it had been holding its breath. The curtains stirred, though the windows were closed. And there, upon the mantel, stood her photograph, the same daguerreotype taken in her youth, tilted slightly to the left. I stared at it for a long time. Her face, even frozen in silver, seemed to look directly through me. The eyes, once so familiar, now held a strange reproach, a calm and terrible knowing. That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake listening to the faint groan of the old house, each sound sharp and deliberate, like a voice learning to speak. At some point, I must have drifted into uneasy dreams, for I awoke to the scent of steeping tea. The air was thick with it, that same sharp sweetness, unmistakable, alive. I rose from bed and followed it to the kitchen, though my body trembled with something close to reverence. The kettle was warm, the cup filled, and a wisp of steam rose faintly from its surface. I stood there in the half-light, my breath caught somewhere between dread and devotion. There was no sound, but the faint ticking of the clock and the whisper of the rising steam. I did not dare touch the cup. I only whispered her name once, Mother. The silence that followed was not empty. It was listening. I began to speak to her openly after that night, though I am not certain when it became habit rather than madness. It started with whispers, soft, uncertain words spoken into empty rooms, apologies offered to the dark. Yet soon I was addressing her as I once had when she sat beside me, my tone instinctively deferential, careful not to offend. I told her of my day, of the weather, of how the ivy had begun to reclaim the garden wall. I confessed small things, a broken cup, an unwatered plant, trivialities I felt she would have wanted to know. Each confession brought a strange peace, as if obedience itself was a kind of prayer. I could feel her presence shifting closer. It began as scent, That distinct mixture of rosewater and old books that always followed her. Then small movements in the corner of my eye, a curtain swaying where there was no breeze, a reflection in the mirror that lingered a heartbeat too long. I was not afraid. I welcomed it. The loneliness of those days had hollowed me, and in that hollow she returned. Not as memory, but as rhythm, as ritual. Each morning I brewed her tea before dawn. Each evening I left the last candle burning in her room. The house became less of a dwelling and more of a shrine. There was one morning when I heard her clearly. I had been kneeling before the hearth, sweeping ashes into the pan, when the air behind me stirred. It was not wind, it was breath. A soft, deliberate exhale that brushed the back of my neck, and then, faintly, unmistakably, I heard my name. Not spoken aloud, but breathed, as though the air itself remembered how her voice once shaped it. The sound was so real, so heartbreakingly gentle, that my knees weakened beneath me. I whispered, "Yes, Mother." But the air had already gone still again. After that, her instructions began to return, not in speech, but in thought. At first, I mistook them for my own impulses, the sudden urge to rearrange the silver, to dust the shelves she once prized, to keep the curtains drawn even when sunlight begged entry. But the precision of these acts betrayed me. Each one mirrored her old habits exactly, down to the fold of the linens, the angle of the cutlery. It was as though her will had grafted itself into mine. I obeyed without question, for in that obedience I felt closer to her, or perhaps less myself. By summer the house had grown unbearably still. The outside world seemed distant, irrelevant. Visitors stopped coming altogether, and I did not miss them. I found companionship only in her presence, a presence I could no longer distinguish from my own thoughts. I began keeping her chair pulled out slightly, as if awaiting her return. Some nights I would hear its faint creak from the next room, a quiet shift, as though someone had just sat down. I never entered immediately. I would wait, allowing her to settle. Then came the second cup. It appeared one evening without explanation, placed opposite my own at the dining table. Both cups were filled, steam rising in perfect rhythm, though I had only poured one. I watched the second cup cool slowly, the surface trembling as if disturbed by invisible breath. I did not question it. I simply raised mine and whispered a blessing, the same one she had always spoken before drinking. The tea burned my tongue, though I could not recall adding heat. That night I dreamt vividly, the first dream in months. I saw her seated across from me at the table, the same calm smile she wore in life, her hands resting lightly atop the lace cloth. But her eyes, they were not the eyes of the woman who had raised me. They were clearer, colder, as if polished by something beyond flesh. When I woke, the taste of tea still lingered on my tongue, metallic and faintly sweet. The days that followed blurred together. I spoke more and ate less. My reflection in the mirror seemed thinner, the eyes more hollow, though I did not mind. She was near. I could feel her watching from every corner, every shadow cast by candlelight. Once, while cleaning her room, I caught sight of the daguerreotype again, that same photograph of her youth. But it was different now. The eyes no longer looked away. They stared directly at me, unwavering. I moved closer to inspect it, trembling. The faintest trace of moisture clung to the silver surface, as though breath had fogged it. I pressed my fingertip to the glass, and when I drew it back, a single word had appeared beneath the condensation, a word written not by hand, but by presence. It read simply, "Drink." I obeyed her. I did not hesitate. That night, I prepared the tea exactly as she had taught me, every movement deliberate, sacred. The water boiled until it screamed, the leaves steeped to near black. I poured 2 cups, one for her, one for myself, and placed them upon the tablecloth she had embroidered before I was born. The scent filled the room, bitter, floral, faintly metallic. It was as if the walls themselves inhaled. I raised my cup in silent reverence, whispering the words she once spoke each evening, to health, to grace, to silence. Then I drank. The warmth spread quickly, but not as it should. It was heavy, almost alive, crawling down my throat like something that wished to stay. My chest tightened, and I tasted something familiar beneath the tannin and herbs, the same sharp sweetness I had once smelled on her lips the night she died. That taste had haunted my dreams, though I had never understood why until then. I realized as the cup emptied that this was not merely tea. It was communion. It was inheritance. It was obedience taken to its end. The room began to waver. Candlelight folded in upon itself. Shadows lengthened and bent at unnatural angles. I could hear her now, not faintly but clearly, as though she stood directly behind me. Her breath brushed my ear, her tone calm, precise, unhurried. "You see, my dear, I never truly left. You only had to taste what I left behind." The voice was unmistakable. It held that same blend of affection and authority that had once ruled my childhood. I wanted to turn, to see her face again, but something in her tone told me that sight was not meant for the living. I stayed very still. The candle nearest me flickered, and for a moment the air thickened the way it does before a storm. Then from the corner of my vision I saw movement, the chair across from me shifting slightly, as if someone had leaned forward. The teacup she once used was trembling, a faint ripple across its surface, though no hand touched it, and then slowly, gracefully it lifted. I heard the soft click of porcelain meeting teeth, a swallow, a breath, and then nothing, only silence. When I finally dared to look up, the chair was empty, but her cup was drained. Only a faint ring of residue marked its edge, and I found myself tracing it with my fingertip, an unthinking, ritualistic motion. I felt light-headed, almost feverish. The tea's warmth lingered inside me, as though it had replaced the blood itself. My hands shook, not from fear but from awe. I whispered again, "Mother." The word came out hoarse, unfamiliar, as if my tongue no longer remembered how to form it. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes. My pulse slowed. My appetite vanished entirely. I slept less and spoke more, not to others but to her. The house began to shift around me. The ticking of the clock no longer matched the rhythm of time. Mirrors clouded even without touch. The air grew heavy with a scent that did not belong to this season. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could feel her inside me, not as memory but as thought. She did not speak now. She directed. My movements grew precise, my gestures familiar. One afternoon I caught my reflection and faltered. The eyes that stared back were not my own. They were softer, darker, patient. They watched me as though judging my posture, my breath, the tremor of my lips. And when I smiled, because I did without meaning to, I saw her smile reflected perfectly, a mirror of one long buried. I felt no horror, only relief. It was as though she had finally taken her rightful place again, within me, through me. But the body resists possession, no matter how devout the heart. My hands trembled violently that evening, unable to pour tea without spilling. I cut my palm on the broken porcelain and watched the blood run down, thick and dark. It looked beautiful in the lamplight, an offering, an unspoken vow. I pressed my bleeding hand against the daguerreotype and whispered the same word she had written upon the glass. "Drink." That night, I dreamt of her once more. She stood at the doorway, not as ghost nor flesh, but something between, her form faintly luminescent, her gown weightless, her eyes endless and calm. She held out her hand, and I saw my own resting in hers, pale and still. She smiled, that quiet maternal smile that had guided my every obedience, and said softly, "Now, we are one." When I awoke, the house was colder, but the room smelled again of tea. There were 2 cups waiting on the table. Both were full. Only one was mine. I do not recall how long I remained at that table. Hours, perhaps days. The passage of time had begun to dissolve around me, as if the air itself carried her rhythm now instead of the clock. Each sip I took from that cup deepened the stillness, binding me further to her voice. I began to see her not only in dreams, but reflected faintly on every surface. In the dull sheen of the kettle, in the glass of the window, in the dark puddles of spilled tea on the floorboards. Her shape was always the same, seated, waiting, patient. Visitors came in those days, though I remember few of their faces. Neighbors, perhaps, or distant cousins, who spoke too softly and watched too carefully. I greeted them from the doorway, never allowing them inside. The air within my home was sacred now, heavy with what I could not explain. Some whispered that grief had driven me toward ruin, that I had taken after my mother. I let them believe what they wished, for in their pity they could not hear her. They could not feel how near she truly was. At night I began to perform small rituals, though I never named them as such. I washed her cup in boiled rainwater, folded her linens anew, lit candles along the stairway where she once walked. Each act was quiet, deliberate, devotional. When I performed them correctly, the air grew warmer, and I could sense her approval like a pulse behind my ribs. But when I hesitated, when I doubted, the flame would flicker and die, and the silence would stretch unbearably thin. It was in those moments I would whisper apologies aloud, as though she might strike me down for carelessness. The poison had become a comfort by then. I brewed it not from malice but necessity, as though to keep her within reach. My body weakened, yet my mind grew sharp, illuminated by her presence. I began recording my thoughts in her old ledger, though the handwriting was no longer mine. Each entry carried the same gentle precision as hers, the same curling letters that once filled the household with quiet dread. When I looked upon those pages, I felt not guilt but inheritance, a continuation, a perfection. One evening, I received a letter sealed with black wax. It bore no name, no address, only the faint impression of a rose pressed deep into the wax, her favorite flower, the same she had planted beneath the kitchen window. Inside was a single scrap of linen, faintly stained. I recognized the pattern immediately. Her nightdress, the one she wore when the fever took her. Beneath it, a few words written in the same elegant hand that had once corrected my posture and praised my obedience. "You have done beautifully." I pressed the cloth to my face and breathed her in. The scent was faint but undeniable, rosewater and iron. I felt tears rise, not from sorrow but from devotion. For so many years I had believed myself her victim. Now I saw the truth. I was her vessel, the continuation of her refinement, her perfection. Every motion of my hand, every measured breath carried the echo of her design. I understood now that she had not poisoned me. She had anointed me. But perfection demands endurance, and endurance decays the body. My skin grew pale as ivory, veins darkening beneath its surface. I wore gloves to hide the changes, though the trembling made them difficult to fasten. My hair, once the color of her own, began to fall in brittle strands. Yet when I saw my reflection, I did not mourn. For the woman who stared back was no longer me, nor was she entirely my mother. She was both intertwined, complete. Soon I found I could no longer leave the house. The light beyond its walls felt cruel, judgmental. The voices of others disturbed the fragile order she and I had made. I lived instead by the rhythm of her instructions, the brewing, the writing, the cleaning, the waiting. Each task repeated, each day identical, until repetition itself became a form of prayer. It was then, in that fragile stillness, that I began to hear a second voice, smaller, trembling, childlike. It called to me from somewhere deep within the walls, where the plaster had cracked and the wallpaper had begun to curl. At first I ignored it, thinking it the echo of my younger self. But as days passed it grew clearer, and I recognized the tone. It was not a memory. It was the voice of my mother as she once was, gentle, warm, and unburdened by what she would later become. "Do you see now," she whispered, "how easily love becomes devotion? And devotion becomes death?" Her words lingered long after the voice faded. For the first time in many months I felt the faintest tremor of doubt, not in her but in myself. If her voice could change, could split in two, then perhaps so could I. And that thought, quiet, almost imperceptible, felt more dangerous than poison itself. I awoke one morning to find the mirrors veiled. Each one in the house, the hallway glass, the parlor oval, the small one near my bedside, covered neatly with white linen. I did not recall doing it, though the knots were tied with my precision. Outside the world had turned pale with frost, and the garden beneath the window lay brittle and grey. The roses she had planted were long dead, their thorns catching what little sunlight broke through the clouds. I felt no sorrow. The beauty of decay had become familiar. It was the last beauty left to me. That night I heard footsteps on the upper landing. Soft, measured, unmistakably hers. I rose without fear and followed, my candle trembling as though the air itself were unsteady. The sound led to her old room, the one I had locked since her passing. The door stood ajar now, though I knew I had sealed it myself years before. Inside the air was thick with the scent of dust and lavender, of something preserved too long. Her chair waited by the window, the teacup placed exactly where she had left it. There was someone sitting there, or rather, something that had learned to hold her shape. The skin was pale as parchment, the eyes hollow yet aware. I knew at once that it was not her ghost, but the echo I had built through years of devotion, my reflection shaped by her memory, fed by my obedience. It looked at me and smiled faintly, a smile too precise, too rehearsed to belong to anything living. I fell to my knees, trembling not with fear but with recognition. "You did as I asked," it said softly, though the lips did not move. "But you were meant to stop." I wanted to speak, to tell her that stopping was impossible, that she had woven herself too deep into my pulse. But my throat locked. The air around me began to tighten, cold and unyielding. The shape in the chair leaned forward. "The dead do not stay," it murmured. "Only the devoted pretend they do." In that moment I understood the cruelty of what I had done. I had mistaken her silence for approval, her absence for guidance. I had not preserved her. I had imprisoned myself in her shadow. Every ritual, every whispered prayer had been a chain, and I had tightened it gladly. My devotion was not love. It was fear refined into worship. The candle died, and for the first time in years I allowed the darkness to settle fully. I heard no voice, no whisper, no breath but my own. The stillness that followed was not peace but release, fragile, terrifying, final. I reached for the veil upon the nearest mirror and pulled it away. What looked back was neither mother nor daughter. It was the ruin left when both had vanished, pale, unmoored, and quietly smiling. When dawn came, the house stood silent. The tea had gone cold. The ledger lay open on the table, a single line written in the center of an empty page. "Perfection is not inherited. It is buried." It has been many years since that morning, though time no longer holds the weight it once did. The seasons move, but the house remains unchanging, its wood swollen with memory. I seldom leave my room now. The walls have learned my breath, and the floorboards creak in rhythm with my heartbeat. Outside, the world whispers of new families, of laughter, of carriages that pass without stopping. But inside there is only the faint hum of something unfinished, a life that refused to fade cleanly. I have grown old within these rooms, older than my reflection dares to show. The neighbors say the house is cursed, that the air inside turns sweet like spoiled fruit. They are not wrong. There are nights when the air tastes of tea again, faint, bitter, and cold. I can almost hear the clink of porcelain from the parlor, followed by the sound of her voice reciting the old verses she loved. But they come softer now, as though memory itself is losing interest in me. Even my guilt feels tired. I sometimes speak aloud, hoping to hear my voice echo back. I tell her that I understand, that I forgive her, and that I have forgiven myself. But the silence that follows is heavier than before. Forgiveness is a cruel thing. It changes nothing, only deepens the knowledge of what cannot be undone. The poison did not end with her. It seeped into the floorboards, into the wood, into the very air I breathe. I am the last vessel of it. The house and I are the same now, aging, hollow, patient. One evening I gathered the old letters, the recipes, the lace gloves she left behind. I burned them all in the hearth, one by one, until the room filled with a scent I had almost forgotten. Warmth. The firelight caught the silver frame of her photograph on the mantel. I watched the glass tremble with heat, her face bending, softening, vanishing. For a moment I thought I saw her truly leave. The house sighed. I swear it, like something released at last. But when the flames died, I noticed one cup still resting on the mantel, untouched, unburned. The very cup she had last used. I do not recall placing it there, nor do I recall keeping it when all else was gone. It sat gleaming faintly in the dark, clean and whole, as if untouched by time. I reached for it, and the porcelain was warm. My hand trembled, and a memory returned, not of her death, but of her laughter, low and knowing. I realized then that the curse was never in the tea, nor in her commands, nor in my obedience. It was in the love that bound us, a love so absolute it mistook surrender for virtue. What I did in faith, in fear, and in love, 3 poisons that taste the same when taken daily. I am the last drop of that mixture, lingering far too long on the tongue of time. Now as I sit by the window where she once prayed, I feel the quiet nearing again, slow, merciful, inevitable. I no longer dream of her forgiveness, only her absence. The world beyond the glass has learned to move without us. Perhaps that is the truest kind of redemption, to be forgotten completely. The doctor says I will not last through winter, though his words sound like something I have heard before. Perhaps from my mother, perhaps from myself. The nights grow longer, and the walls lean closer, listening as I speak these final thoughts into the hollow air. I do not speak for mercy, nor for remembrance. I speak because silence has grown too heavy to bear alone. I have carried her voice for 50 years. Now it trembles within me like a dying bird. I feel her in the ache of my hands, in the rhythm of my pulse, patient, waiting. The house has begun to forget me. The mirrors no longer show my face clearly. They hold only shapes of dust and candlelight. I think of the parlor where she used to sit, how the afternoon sun would catch her hair like a flame caught in glass. That room has turned grey now. The curtains hang stiff with mildew. Yet sometimes when the wind pushes through the cracks, I swear I smell the faint sweetness of her perfume, violets and something darker beneath. I wonder if memory itself carries a scent, if it clings to us long after the soul has moved on. Last night I dreamt of her for the first time in decades. She stood by the old oak table, pouring tea into 2 cups. Her hands were steady, her eyes were kind. There was no malice in them, only the quiet certainty of a mother tending to what she believes is right. She offered me the cup, and though I knew what it contained, I took it. Not out of fear this time, but understanding. When I raised it to my lips, she smiled, the same small, distant smile she gave me when I was a child. I woke with the taste of bitterness still on my tongue. This morning I set the table once more. Just 2 cups as it was before. The house is cold, but the act warms me. I speak aloud, telling her that it is time, that I am ready. My hand shakes as I pour the tea, the liquid dark and steady like the blood that once bound us. I do not ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness is for the living. I only ask that when the quiet comes, it comes gently. The window is open now. The air smells of rain and salt from the harbor. Somewhere far off a bell tolls, slow, deep and distant, like an echo of prayer. I lift the cup and the world around me seems to still. My reflection in the glass is not mine anymore. It is hers, faint and waiting. I whisper her name once, softly, without anger, and take the final sip. There is no pain, only warmth spreading through the chest, through the breath, through everything that once clung to life. The house exhales, long and low, as if unburdened. The candlelight folds inward, and the air grows quiet, utterly, perfectly quiet. If anyone should find this place, they will smell the faint sweetness of tea and see two cups resting side by side. And perhaps for a brief moment, they will think it a love story.